The US lawmakers, after nearly 6 months of will they won't they on passing another big Ukraine aid bill, made a decision and passed the $61 billion aid bill. During the same time, Ukraine's forces have been on the defensive on the battlefield. Indeed, the Russian war machine has been revving up and Russian territorial gains have steadily accumulated. This video will cover what have the Russians gained in those last 6 months and what changes they implemented in the way they wage war to achieve those gains, and we'll explore what problems beset Ukrainian forces. Finally, the big US aid bill will be discussed and quantified, trying to project its impact onto the future battlefield. In Binkov's opinion, the US aid as it stands now may not be sufficient to compensate for Russian advantages, but to learn about it all in detail, stay tuned. The US not releasing any further aid for Ukraine for half a year has had a big cascading effect. Sure, it's recently been corrected, but the damage has been done, and that came as the second punch in a 1-2 punch series to Ukraine. First punch being the failure of the Ukraine summer offensive in 2023. Those two events hurt Ukraine's morale quite a bit. Of course, the fact Ukraine is short on troops means it did not grant leave to its troops. Being at the front for 2 years is also not good for morale. Morale is something that's not really quantifiable, but it's an area where Ukraine had quite an advantage when the war started. Now it's hard to assess where Ukraine's morale is, but it may not be any better than the morale of the average Russian soldier. So what has actually been happening lately in Ukraine? 2023 saw the big Ukrainian offensive, and during the whole year, Ukraine took some 190 square miles of territory. That's not a lot of territory. Russia has actually taken more territory during 2023, at some 410 square miles. Those Ukrainian and Russian figures are sometimes accounting for the same territory changing hands back and forth. Bigger Russian gains account for many small bites of Ukrainian land, all over the front line, and for Bakhmut, which fell in May 2023 after months of fighting. But as 2023 came to a close, the Ukrainian side almost stopped taking territory even in counterattacks, and mostly settled for defense. Indeed, from January 1st, 2024 to mid-April, Ukraine took only a few square miles, while Russia took over 140 square miles of territory. Compared to a similar lasting period of September 2023 to end of year, Russian net gains increased by 5 times. Russian Defense Minister Shoigu corroborated that around mid-April, saying that Russia had taken 150 square miles in 2024. In the last week or so, however, Ukrainian lines around Ochertne have started buckling quickly. In the context of the whole Ukraine, those are still minuscule figures. At the start of 2022, Russia held 11% of Ukraine's pre-2014 territory, meaning back then Ukraine controlled little over 200,000 square miles. So 2023 and 2024 net Russian gains so far are still tiny overall, at 0.18% of Ukraine's 2022 territory. Basically, the battles were and are fought for small villages, with the open space between villages being deadly for any side trying to move. That being said, Ukraine has still been losing some villages fairly regularly, especially in the last weeks when it appears Ukraine is physically lacking enough units and firepower to plug in the holes made by Russian attacks and react quickly to those Russian gains before Russians consolidate their lines. At the end of 2023, the front line seemed as if it would remain static, but we've also projected the US aid would continue fairly quickly. In reality, it took 6 months for the US lawmakers to finally approve the next big batch of funding. Not only did that affect morale, but several key weapon systems were simply not available in sufficient numbers, notably air defense missiles and artillery rounds. Both can be crucial for defense. When the Russians advance, they suppress the defenders with constant artillery fire. Thus, the defenders can't shoot as effectively on the advancing Russian troops. Had Ukraine had ample artillery, it would not only use said artillery at the advancing troops, but also at the Russian artillery supporting the attack. Air defense woes are just as important, and they came at the time when Russia revved up its missile and bomb production. It's important to note that before the war, Russia was unprepared when it came to standoff precision bombs. In early 2023, Russia used only a handful of such weapons a day. But come late March, Ukraine said Russia used 700 such bombs in a span of just 6 days. One might estimate that Russian production is approaching the highest ever US JDAM procurement rates. Basically, while the mass artillery suppresses the defenders, making them take cover, the large bombs demolish actual defenses. They can bring down entire buildings where defenders might hide. They can dig out large portions of a trench, complete with a concrete bunker. When used methodically, enough bombs over a long enough period, it's not surprising that the effect can be one of Ukrainian defenses slowly crumbling. If you want to know more about said Russian bombs and their impact on the war, we can refer you to our Patron-only and YouTube member-only video. The link is down below in this video's description. Any patron or member of even the lowest tier can access it. More about all that after our video. Anyway, there are other factors too, like the increasing number of Russian-guided artillery rounds, as well as more and more observation drones and kamikaze drones. Those were all a factor at the front lines. Back in the interior of Ukraine, that mentioned lack of air defense systems and missiles means that Russia has increasingly been hitting logistics and industrial targets, factories and depots where Ukraine makes and stores weapons, railways and railway bridges connecting those depots with the front lines. A year earlier, Russia was attacking electrical substations, but now it's hitting turbines in power plants. Replacing those may take many months. And now that Ukrainian air defenses are lacking missiles, Russian missiles can get through in enough numbers to do the job. While Ukraine's army isn't directly dependent on electricity, the broader industrial and logistical ecosystem supporting the war effort is. Right now, the overall effect is still manageable for Ukraine. 20% of its start of the year electricity production volume was lost. But if similar attacks continue, already by summer there might be serious shortages of electricity to the industry. By the winter, the situation for many Ukrainian citizens may be more dire than it ever was during 2022 attacks on power network. According to the Institute for War, during 2022 and 2023, Russia launched some 11,000 missiles and missile drones against Ukraine. But while Ukrainians were reporting 70 to even 90% interception rates during most of 2023, lately they've reported worse performance. Late 2023 and early 2024 saw a 50 to 60% interception rate. During the last month, Ukraine reported that it dropped below 50%. Initially, Russia was using a lot more missiles per quarter. Those included starting stocks and repurposed SAM or anti-ship missiles. Last quarter of 2023, missile firings were fairly small, but then in the first quarter of 2024, missile launches went up by 250%, with drone launches increasing some as well. With interception rates dropping, effects of those figures compounded even further. That's why Germany urgently transferred another Patriot battery to Ukraine this April, its third, after sending its second battery only this past December. It's plausible further Patriot batteries may finally be shipped by the US as well, now that aid has restarted. Also, it's not just artillery shell woes for Ukraine. With more recon drones, attack drones and other standoff munitions, Ukraine has been losing artillery pieces themselves. Oryx is one source of telling Ukrainian lost equipment, but counting hits on Russian media pages leads to a different count. Now both sources may indeed be off the actual result, but it just shows there may be in fact more pieces lost, as the tempo of new videos showing artillery pieces hit has increased over the last several months. All those morale woes and equipment woes have led to both higher casualties, more units surrendering and fewer people volunteering, which resulted in Ukraine's military needing more fresh troops sooner than it thought it would need them. Recently, Ukrainian mobilization law has been changed, but frankly those changes aren't that big. Lowering the age limit from 27 to 25 can in theory bring in several 100,000 troops, but in practice a fair share of those have already volunteered or have fled the country. Many are holding jobs important to the Ukrainian economy, and some are hiding from mobilization. A New York Times article from April 2024 suggests fewer than 350,000 are currently living in Ukraine. it's plausible that less than half could actually be mobilized. Indeed, Ukraine's Economic Committee said that even though Ukraine should on paper have 11 million men aged 25 to 60, only 3.7 million are subject to mobilization, with the rest being already mobilized, having disabilities, fleeing the country, or in the most part being reserved for critical industrial tasks. Those millions don't mean Ukraine can mobilize them all. People are still largely unwilling, and there is no logistical system in place to train and field 3 million people at once. While in December Ukraine's general staff had said 400 to 500,000 more troops were needed, recently those figures have been amended. Ukraine's commander-in-chief Syrskyi did not cite the new figure, but did say that the previous 500,000 figure was reviewed and, quote, significantly reduced. It's not that the situation on the front line has gotten better, but it's plausible that the new figures have been amended to better fit the reality of how many can actually be mobilized. So Ukraine is not in a good position right now. It's holding, but what can US aid actually do to help? Here's what the US aid package includes: 11 billion for US operations in the region, including logistical support for Ukraine, for example, transport of supplies and arms. That includes vast US intelligence gathering efforts, something that's been indispensable to Ukraine. 13 billion reserved for Ukraine to be spent on buying weapons from US manufacturers. That's through a program called the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. Those are new weapons, often top of the line, but complex weapons often need a year or two to be delivered. Plus, US arms makers usually charge very high prices. Indeed, another line in the aid list is to compensate Ukraine for its expenses while buying new US weapons. There's also almost 8 billion in financial assistance and a few billion more in humanitarian assistance, but that's not military aid. One last item that is military related is 23 billion to the Pentagon to replenish its stocks. Now, that line is often misunderstood. On one hand, yes, that money is indeed going to the US DoD and not to Ukraine. But on the other hand, that line has in the past been very much tied to something else that isn't even listed in the aid list. And that is Presidential Drawdown Authority Fund. Basically, the US government was sending ready-made stocks of US military weapons to Ukraine. Those were not included directly in aid bills, but they have been internally valued. 54 PDA packages have been sent from the start of the war to December 2023. Then the packages stopped, as the Pentagon said it's not comfortable with draining its stocks further without getting money for replenishing them. Sadly, tallying up the precise amount of money that DoD has received in 2022 and 2023 to replenish their stocks has proven hard. It appears that by September 2022, Pentagon had received some 10 billion in such funds, but it's not known how much was received in 2023, for example. At one point in March 2024, the Pentagon said it was 10 billion in the hole because of the weapons it sent directly from its stocks to Ukraine. Given that the total aid so far was 24 billion, it might indicate that during 2023, further 4 billion were given to DoD to replenish its stocks. That also suggests two more things: that the Pentagon is willing to go up to 10 billion in debt, so to say, when draining its stocks, and that with the 23 billion of new aid to replenish its stocks, the Pentagon will be some 13 billion in the black, which suggests it may send at least 13 billion more of its stocks to Ukraine, but possibly as much as 23 billion if it's again willing to go in the red for a time being. According to Kiel's Institute Ukraine aid data, the US has so far sent over $45 billion worth of military aid. That's largely by December 2023, as after that the aid dried up completely. So if Ukraine receives 23 billion in the short and medium term from existing US stocks and another 15 billion in the long term for newly produced weapons, that's gonna leave a mark on the battlefield. But what sort of mark are we talking about? Trouble is, no aid ever comes quickly. Congress appropriates money and then the government spends it. That may take months, but it's unlikely that all PDA funds would be spent in mere months. After all, it took 22 months for the US to send the first 24 billion worth of weapons from its stocks to Ukraine. Indeed, even if sent twice as fast, this new package of aid, 23 billion, will still plausibly take a whole year. And those new weapons purchases might take at least a year to over 2 years for certain items. Even today, 20 months after 6 new built NASAMS SAM launchers have been contracted, not all have been delivered to Ukraine yet. The actual text of the bill doesn't stipulate when the aid will come, but it does set limits as to until when the money will be available. So it seems likely that part of the money will indeed be fast-tracked and spent by the end of 2024. Certainly hundreds of thousands of artillery shells and thousands of SAM missiles may start to be transferred within days. But it's also quite possible that much of the aid, including some directly from US stocks, will still be cut up into pieces and that some of it will take until 2026 to come. All the PDA funds so far were done that way. The US lawmakers have paused the original aid package proposal back from November 2023. Despite the fact Ukraine's position has worsened since, the new April aid package isn't really much different from that November package proposal. The April aid bill is roughly 9 billion bigger when it comes to direct weapons aid. Whether that's enough to compensate for 6 months of no aid coming in, that's a valid question. Right now Ukraine is losing ground, even if very slowly. It's probably losing fewer troops than Russia while it's defending, but given that Russia can produce several times more fresh troops, that might not be sustainable in the long term. So massive uninterrupted aid is crucial. Latest US aid is a welcome step in that direction, but if indeed this latest package will be given piece by piece until 2026, and if no further significant aid will be contracted much earlier than that, then Ukraine is unlikely to perform well. Precision weapons such as guided artillery and SAM missiles are particularly expensive, as Russia is using hundreds of missiles per month. Even a few thousand Patriot and AMRA missiles per year might not be enough. Sure, the aid may be enough to mostly hold the line and prevent large Russian territory gains, but in the long term, an eventual peace settlement with Russia getting to hold whatever it's taken by that point is looking more and more likely. That's it for this video, but before we go, to share more about our business plans. YouTube is great, of course, but it's really been getting worse and worse ever since Shorts came into focus. Many channels, not just ours, are experiencing steep drops in views, and it doesn't look like that will change. So to survive, we simply need to look for additional distribution venues. For now, we want to try out our already established Patreon and YouTube member offerings as distribution platforms. Basically, this new additional video will be available to all patrons and all YouTube members, even if they're lowest tier. We'll see how this initiative plays out in the future. Right now, it's just a test to see if it can help Binkov Battlegrounds survive. Thanks to everyone for your help and for watching us. Salutations. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.